What if a single arrival could erase a village from the face of the earth? In the cruel winter of 1930, deep within the frost-bitten forests of northern Canada, a lone trapper trudged through snow that swallowed his boots, his breath thick in the night air. When he entered the small, isolated settlement of Anjikuni, he found silence where laughter once lingered, empty houses where fires had burned, and graves whose bones had been stolen. Men, women, and children, all vanished, leaving only hunger in the air and footprints that led nowhere. Was it human cruelty, an ancient curse, or something darker still? And before we descend into this shadowed tale, traveler, bind yourself to this circle. Subscribe, not as a spectator, but as a keeper of forgotten whispers. For in these chronicles, every echo matters, and every silence hides a warning. The wind tore across the northern wilds like a wolf's howl, dragging snow in long ribbons over the endless white. Joe Labelle pressed forward, each step sinking into the crust of ice, his body stiff with cold, his breath leaving clouds that seemed to freeze in mid-air. His fur-lined hood was stiff with frost, his mittens soaked from the weight of snow. Days of wandering through unbroken wilderness had worn him thin, but hunger was not his sharpest enemy. No, it was the silence, that hollow, unnatural silence of a forest that should have been alive with the crack of branches, the rustle of foxes, the distant cry of owls. It was as if every creature had buried itself beneath the snow to escape something that hunted the air itself. Anjikuni Village. He had heard its name whispered like a lantern in the dark, a small settlement where weary trappers could barter for food, trade stories, or warm their bones beside a fire. He had been there before. He remembered the laughter of children playing near the lake, the sharp smell of smoked fish curling from chimneys, the friendly nods of hunters who carried rifles on their shoulders. It was a place carved out of wilderness, a fragile heartbeat of humanity in the crushing chest of the north. And tonight, as Joe staggered toward its wooden cabins, he longed for nothing more than a bowl of stew and the sight of living faces. Yet what greeted him was not warmth. It was a stillness so vast it seemed to press against his ribs. No smoke curled from the chimneys, no dogs barked to announce his approach. The only sound was the crunch of his boots and the thunder of his own blood in his ears. The cabins loomed against the snow like blackened teeth, their doors hanging ajar as though mouths frozen mid-scream. Joe paused, squinting through the falling snow, half expecting to see a figure move behind the pale glow of a window. None came. He stumbled to the first cabin. The door swung open with little effort, the hinges creaking like a bone pulled from its socket. Inside, the hearth was cold, ashes lying gray and lifeless. On the table rested a bowl of stew, hardened by frost, spoon still sunk within. A coat hung on the wall, waiting for its owner's return. Boots lay by the bed, empty, their laces undone. Joe's heart pounded as he stepped deeper into the room, his breath fogging the air. Everything felt paused, suspended in the moment when life had been interrupted. He searched another cabin, then another. The same sight met him at each, clothing left behind, rifles propped against walls, meals abandoned mid-bite. It was as if the inhabitants had risen in unison and walked out into the night without thought, without preparation, without fear of the cold that would have surely killed them. A shiver deeper than any wind carved down Joe's spine. The village was empty, not with the slow decay of time, but with the sudden violence of disappearance. And then he saw them. The dogs. Chained near the edge of the village, their bodies lay stiff and twisted, eyes glazed with frost, ribs sharp beneath thinning fur. They had starved where they stood, left without care, their whimpers unanswered. Joe crouched, staring at them with a sickness rising in his stomach. These were not neglected beasts. The people of Anjikuni loved their animals, relied on them. To leave them like this was unthinkable, unless they hadn't left at all, unless something had taken them. The wind rose, shrieking through the cabins as though the village itself tried to warn him away. Joe pulled his coat tighter, his breath trembling, his body rigid with dread. He felt the forest watching, every tree a sentinel of secrets. Something vast and unseen had passed through here, and the silence was its scar. And as Joe Labelle stepped back into the snow, staring at the rows of cabins like graves without markers, he realized he had not stumbled upon an abandoned settlement. He had stepped into the mouth of something hungry, something that was not yet finished. The night closed around him, and from the frozen lake came a sound, a crack like a bone breaking, then silence. Joe Labelle's breath clouded before him as he moved from cabin to cabin, his boots dragging through snow that felt deeper with each step. The village seemed endless now, each doorway a gaping mouth, each window an unblinking eye. Inside every home he entered, the same story repeated itself, a world interrupted mid-motion. A rifle leaning against a wall, a half-sewn coat with the needle still threaded, dangling like a vein severed too soon. A chair pushed back from the table as if its owner had only stepped away for a moment, yet never returned. The stillness pressed upon him, growing heavier with each discovery. Villages vanish slowly, through famine, disease, migration, but this was something else, something unnatural. There were no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, no blood. Only absence. Absence so complete it throbbed like a wound in the air. Joe knew these people. He had shaken their hands, traded their furs, laughed with their children. Yet now they were ghosts, etched only in memory, while their possessions remained like relics awaiting mourners. The silence itself began to pulse in his ears, louder than wind, louder than his own heartbeat. He remembered tales whispered by Cree elders of spirits that devour sound, leaving villages hushed forever. He thought of those stories now, though he had always dismissed them as fireside superstition. Still, the emptiness around him felt less like abandonment and more like theft, as if something had stolen the voices, the warmth, even the breath of Anjikuni. Then, near the edge of the village, Joe came upon the graveyard. His blood turned to ice. Where markers once stood in neat rows, the earth gaped open like torn flesh. Graves had been exhumed. Every mound of earth lay ruptured, splintered boards tossed aside, holes raw against the snow. He stumbled forward, crouching over one hollowed pit, and saw that not a bone, not a thread of cloth, not a scrap of coffin lining remained. It was not the clumsy work of animals. It was deliberate, precise. Something or someone had taken the dead. Joe's mind swam. Why desecrate the resting places of ancestors? What purpose lay in stealing bones from their frozen slumber? The thought struck him suddenly. Perhaps the living had followed their dead, summoned away by whatever had clawed open these graves. He recoiled from the thought, his hands trembling, his chest tight. The snow thickened, swirling down in veils that blurred the horizon, burying his footprints as quickly as he made them. He tried to count the open graves but lost track. There were too many. The wind howled between the wooden crosses that still stood, rattling like bones shaken in a bag. Somewhere beneath the drifts, he swore he heard a muffled whisper, a voice without shape, humming a name he could not understand. The forest loomed beyond the cemetery, its black spires rising like a cathedral of shadows. Joe felt its pull, a beckoning that twisted in his gut. He wanted to run, but the snow dragged at his boots like hands. He wanted to scream, but the silence swallowed his voice whole. And as he staggered back toward the cabins, eyes wide, he knew it was not only the living who had been stolen from Anjikuni. The dead had been claimed too, and whatever had taken them was not finished. From the forest a crack rang out, sharp and sudden, like a branch snapping beneath a weight too heavy to see. Then silence again, heavier, deeper, infinite. Joe Labelle staggered through the village like a man drunk on dread, each cabin he passed gnawing at him with its emptiness. His stomach growled, hollow and sharp, but hunger of the flesh was nothing compared to the hunger of the silence that pressed in from every side. It was as though the snow itself yearned to consume him, to drag him beneath its weight until he too was buried among the vanished. He stopped near the sled dogs again, their stiffened bodies bowed by the chains that held them. Frost glistened on their muzzles, their jaws locked in grimaces of agony. He crouched, running a mittened hand over the fur of one beast whose ribs jutted like prison bars through its hide. Their deaths were not clean. They had not been slaughtered. They had starved, their bones feeding on themselves in the long wait for masters who never returned. Joe's throat tightened. These animals were lifelines in the wilderness, treated as companions, as brothers in survival. To leave them like this was unthinkable, unless it had not been a choice. Unless the people of Anjikuni had been taken so swiftly, so completely, they had no chance even to unleash their own dogs. He rose unsteadily, the weight of old stories pressing into his memory. Nights around fires in lonely camps had been filled with whispers of things that haunted the north. Spirits that fed not on flesh alone, but on the very presence of the living. The Cree elders had spoken of them, shadow walkers who arrived without tracks, who lured entire villages into silence. Joe had laughed then, warming his hands by the fire, dismissing the words as superstition. But now, surrounded by frozen meals, empty boots, and exhumed graves, his laughter returned as a bitter taste in his mouth. His eyes drifted toward the frozen lake. It stretched beyond the village like a sheet of bone, fissures crawling across its surface in jagged lines. The sound he had heard earlier, a crack like breaking bone, echoed in his mind. He imagined the villagers standing there, staring into its abyss, waiting for something to emerge from beneath. The idea turned his stomach, yet he could not turn away from the pull. He trudged toward the lake, each step dragging as though the snow itself conspired to hold him back. At the shoreline, he stopped. The ice groaned beneath its own weight, a sound like a great beast shifting in its sleep. Joe's breath hitched. He leaned closer, peering into the blue depths beneath the cracked glass. Nothing moved, only endless dark, yet in that dark he felt watched. Not by eyes he could see, but by something vast, ancient, and starving. His reflection stared back at him, warped by the ice, his own face stretched thin and gaunt, like a corpse preserved beneath the frost. A sudden gust whipped across the lake, stinging his skin with shards of snow. He stumbled back, his heart hammering. Behind him, the forest shuddered as though stirred by something enormous moving just out of sight. The silence deepened once more, thick as burial cloth, leaving him gasping for air. Joe Labelle clutched his chest, teeth chattering, and realized he was not merely standing in an empty village. He was standing in the belly of a hunger that had not yet finished feeding. And then, faint through the storm, he thought he heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching across the snow, slow, deliberate, coming closer. The storm gathered teeth as Joe Labelle dragged himself back from the lake. Snow biting at his face, his lungs burning with each breath. He could not rid himself of the sound, those footsteps he swore he heard moving in rhythm with his own. Yet when he turned, nothing stirred but the endless sweep of white. His heart thudded like a war drum, urging him to flee, but some darker pull guided his steps toward the graveyard once more. The village cabins stood behind him like hollow ribs. Before him stretched the field of opened earth, a congregation of emptiness. He stumbled between the graves, his boots crunching over the brittle crust of snow. The holes yawned wide, black wounds against the pallor of winter. He knelt at the edge of one, his hands shaking as he touched the soil. To his shock, the earth beneath the frost was warm, an impossible warmth in a world devoured by ice. He snatched his hand back as though burned, staring at his palm, half expecting to see it smeared with blood. Nothing. Only the trembling of his own flesh. The snow fell thicker now, smothering the landscape in a shroud. But within the storm, Joe began to hear it, whispers. Faint, broken, scattered syllables that rose from the pits like sighs escaping the throats of the buried. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound crawled deeper, threading into his bones. They were not voices he could understand, but they carried names. Names twisted by the wind, repeated in the rhythm of lament. He stared into the nearest hollow, imagining the bodies that once lay there. Men hardened by the hunt, women weaving by firelight, children chasing dogs through the snow, all gone, their remains erased with surgical precision. It was no animal that had done this. The coffins had been opened carefully, their contents removed without chaos. Whoever or whatever had taken them did so with purpose. With ritual, Joe's chest constricted, his breath shallow, his mind clawing for answers. Were these graves emptied to summon something from beneath the lake? Had the living followed the dead, their bodies drawn into the night by promises he dared not imagine? He pictured the villagers standing in a circle, chanting into the storm, the ground splitting open as their ancestors rose, or were consumed by something far older. His skin prickled with cold sweat. The wind shrieked suddenly, tearing through the cemetery, rattling the wooden crosses that still stood. They clattered against one another like brittle bones in the hands of a giant. Joe staggered, shielding his face from the stinging snow when he saw movement, just at the tree line. A figure black against the pale storm. Still watching, his breath seized. He blinked, and it was gone. He turned back toward the graves, but the whispers had grown louder, rising in cadence, as though the storm itself was reciting an incantation. His knees buckled. He stumbled backward, his foot slipping into one of the pits. For a moment, he felt as though the earth pulled at him, tugging him down to join those who had been stolen. He yanked himself free, collapsing onto the snow, his heart hammering like a drumbeat of panic. And in the hush that followed, the storm paused. The silence was worse than the whispers. Joe Labelle lay on his back, chest heaving, and realized with terror that the graves were not emptied by hands alone. Something beneath the ground was awake. From deep within the soil came a faint, deliberate knock, 3 sharp raps, like knuckles against a coffin lid. Joe Labelle staggered from the graveyard as though fleeing a battlefield, his breath ragged, his heart thrashing like a beast in a trap. The storm swallowed his footprints as quickly as he made them, erasing all proof of his passage. Behind him the graves seemed to hum, their silent mouths wider with every gust of wind, as if mocking his fear. He pressed onward toward the forest edge, desperate for the company of trees, though their blackened spires promised no comfort. The pines loomed like watchmen, their limbs clawing against the sky, heavy with snow that sagged like shrouds. Joe paused, his torchlight flickering weakly, swallowed by the shadows between the trunks. The forest was alive, though not with the ordinary crack of branches or the scamper of hidden creatures. No, this life moved in silence. Shapes slipped between the trees, flickering at the edge of vision. Too tall, too thin, too swift to be men. He strained his eyes, yet every time he focused, the shadows stilled, pretending to be bark, pretending to be night. His mind clawed for reason, yet memory betrayed him with the words of an old Cree elder, spoken years ago when the northern sky had burned green with auroras. There are beings older than the rivers, the elder had warned, watchers who feed when villages forget their prayers. They do not kill with teeth or claws. They take the silence of one man, then another, until none remain to speak the loss. Joe had laughed then, but here, now, in Anjikuni's frozen grave, the laughter rotted in his throat, his torch sputtered. The flame hissed, shrinking low, as if even fire was afraid to shine too bright in this place. He shook it desperately, sparks spitting into the dark, but each flare only revealed the terror closing in. Shadows standing still, too still, their edges sharper than trees should be. They were watching him. Joe stumbled backward, his boot catching on a root hidden beneath the snow. He fell hard, the torch flying from his grip, hissing into the drift and sputtering out. Darkness devoured him. He lay sprawled, his chest heaving, listening for movement. None came, only silence, heavier than before, pressing against his ears like a water-drowning sound. Yet he felt them there, surrounding him, the weight of eyes without pupils, without lids. His own thoughts turned traitor. Perhaps he had not stumbled upon this mystery by chance. Perhaps he had been brought here, not as a rescuer, not as a survivor, but as a witness, a man chosen to see, to remember, to carry the tale into a world that would not believe it. A living voice dragged into silence's domain. The thought struck deep, colder than the storm. Something shifted in the dark, just beyond his reach. A crunch of snow, deliberate, slow. Joe's breath hitched, his limbs locked in terror. He did not dare move, for to move would be to draw attention, to confirm his presence. And then he felt it, a breath, warm and foul, grazing the back of his neck. He lurched to his feet, stumbling blindly through the trees, branches clawing his face, tearing at his coat. He could not see, yet he felt the shadows pace him, circling, drawing him deeper into the labyrinth of pines. The storm above roared, a great throat-swallowing sound, until nothing remained but his own ragged sobs. And then suddenly, silence again. Utter merciless silence. He froze, chest heaving, listening to the pounding of his heart. The forest stilled, every branch frozen mid-sway. Joe turned in a slow, trembling circle, but the shadows were gone, vanished as if they had never been. He sank to his knees, snow soaking through to the bone, and realized with sick dread, the silence was not emptiness. It was presence. Something vast and unseen now stood with him, closer than his own breath. And then, just as he dared to whisper a prayer, the snow at his feet shifted, as though something beneath the ground had begun to rise. When at last Joe Labelle escaped the clutch of that forest, staggering half-mad and frostbitten into the wilderness, he left behind more than footprints. He left behind his certainty, his reason, the very marrow of his soul. Days later, trembling and hollow-eyed, he reached the nearest outpost. His tale spilled from cracked lips, words tumbling like broken ice. The vanished villagers, the starved dogs, the graves yawning open, the whispers, the shadows that breathed down his neck. His listeners recoiled, some crossing themselves, others narrowing their eyes with suspicion. Madness, they muttered. Hunger dreams, a trapper's delirium, yet his terror clung to them like frost on their beards, and soon the mounted police were summoned. Hardened men, their uniforms stiff against the cold, rifles slung over their shoulders, lanterns burning with mortal light. They laughed at Labelle's shaking hands, mocked the tremor in his voice, but still they followed him. For even scoffers cannot resist the lure of a mystery whispered in blood and bone. The journey back to Anjikuni was cruel, the wind slicing their faces raw, the snow blinding. But at last, the village emerged from the storm. The cabins stood as he had left them, their doors ajar, their windows blank. The police entered with the bravado of men who trusted in their own steel. But soon their confidence faltered. The hearths were cold, the meals frozen mid-spoon, the rifles abandoned, the boots untouched. The graves still gaped like wounds, their earth torn open. The dogs still lay stiff and wasted, their ribs like knives. But one detail hollowed the marrow of those hardened men. There were no footprints. Not Joe's, not anyone's. The snow lay smooth, untouched, as though no living thing had crossed the village in months. Joe's protests rose in a fever, his voice cracking, but the officers only exchanged uneasy glances. They searched every corner, finding nothing. No blood, no signs of violence, no evidence at all except the echo of absence. Around the fire that night, their laughter was quieter, brittle. One man whispered that Joe had summoned spirits, that his footsteps had been erased by powers older than their rifles. Another muttered of cults, of human hands stealing bodies for rituals too foul to name. Their captain, his voice strained though steady, swore that explanations always existed, that men had fled, that wolves had unearthed the dead, that Joe's mind had unraveled in the cold. Yet when he spoke, he would not meet their eyes. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the wind howled through the cabins, the officers woke to a sound none would confess aloud, faint laughter. High and thin, like children playing in the snow, it flitted between the houses, then vanished when lanterns were raised. The men clutched their rifles tighter, their bravado drowned beneath a rising tide of fear. By morning, the snow had deepened, drifts climbing the walls of the cabins. The officers called for retreat, but not all believed they would leave untouched. One swore he saw a figure watching from the tree line, tall and narrow, unmoving in the storm. Another claimed he felt the ground stir beneath his bedroll, as though something alive had coiled beneath the earth. They left with haste, their lanterns swallowed by the forest, their silence heavier than their packs. And Joe Labelle, shivering in their midst, felt no relief in their departure. For he knew what the others would not say aloud. The village had not been abandoned. It had been claimed, and what claimed it was still hungry. Behind them, as they vanished into the storm, the snow at the graves shifted once more. Years passed, and Anjikuni faded from the tongues of officials and newspapers, buried beneath denials and half-truths. Yet in the wilderness, memory is not so easily erased. The cabins, left to rot, sagged under the weight of winters, their roofs collapsing like ribs breaking inward. The hearthstones cracked, swallowed by moss and frost. The graveyard disappeared beneath tangled brush and drifting snow, its markers splintered, its holes filled by silence. The village became a scar upon the land, concealed but never healed. Yet the wilderness is a keeper of whispers, Trappers who wandered too close spoke of hearing voices across the lake, mothers calling children in tones thin as smoke, men singing old hunting songs, laughter that rose and broke like glass. No footprints followed those sounds. No figures appeared. Only the echo remained, carried by winds that seemed to come from nowhere. Artifacts emerged, offered to the world like riddles. A rifle half buried in frost, its barrel rusted though its stock remained whole. A doll stitched of cloth, its button eyes clouded, found drifting at the lake's edge. A page torn from a journal, its ink smeared but words still legible. The lights are calling us. Each relic was evidence of presence, yet proof of nothing. They deepened the enigma instead of solving it, feeding the legend until Anjikuni was no longer a village, but a myth. The people spoke of it differently depending on who told the story. Some said it was starvation, a desperate migration into the cold that claimed them all. Others whispered of cults, of men who exhumed their own dead and followed them into rituals beneath the aurora. And still others swore it was no human hand at all, but a hunger older than the trees. A force that took not only the living but the very dead, leaving silence as its monument. Generations turned the tale into caution, a story told by firelight. Stay close, stay faithful, stay wary, for the silence will come if you do not. Children trembled at the name Anjikuni, imagining empty houses filled with shadows. Hunters spat when passing its rumored ground, muttering prayers to keep its hunger from following. The mounted police dismissed it, reports vanished into dusty drawers, but the story lived on where paper could not reach, and still the land remembered. On nights when the auroras burned green across the sky, some travelers swore they saw the village again, not in ruins, but alive, its windows glowing, its hearths burning, voices spilling joy into the night. Drawn by the sight, they would step closer, only for the lights to dim, the houses to vanish, and the silence to rush back in, leaving nothing but snow. Anjikuni became less a place than a wound in time. A village that had not died but been devoured, leaving echoes that slipped between generations like a haunting inheritance. And somewhere in that wilderness, the silence still breathes, waiting, patient, eternal. For legends do not rest, and the vanished never truly sleep. They linger in the shadows, in the wind, in the hunger of the snow, forever calling, forever unanswered. And if you stand on the frozen lake long enough, you may hear it too, footsteps crunching slowly behind you. Though when you turn, the world is empty. The silence follows. Always.